Good evening, everybody. It hasn't been a good month for accidents. Well, it's been a good month for accidents, but there's been too bloody many of them. That UPS aircraft would have to be one of the worst accidents I've ever witnessed. Must have been, you know what we're talking about.
Engine falling out of the pod.
The MD-11 with the engine flicking out over the top. Can you be any more behind the eight ball than those poor guys were?
Yeah.
Hey, the most critical point for them, the most critical point for the engine.
Yep.
They just had nowhere to go. We're going to talk tonight, or at least Ray is going to talk tonight about CRM, Cockpit Resource Management. The best piece of cockpit resource management that I have ever seen was a DC-3, and on the co-pilot's side of the instrument panel, there was a placard, and it said, "Sit down, shut up, and touch nothing."
We'll talk about that sort of captain.
You like that one?
Yes,
You would have flown that aeroplane, I'm sure.
You'll get a mention here.
Okay. All right, Ray, you can stand up and take it on.
Thank you. Okay, cockpit resource management. The late 1950s, early 1960s saw the last days of the reciprocating engines, saw the introduction of jet aircraft, and with them a tremendous level of reliability of equipment and aircraft, a whole new level of safety. Well, as I was saying, we had a new level of reliability of equipment and aircraft in the early 60s, but there were still accidents. So what I'm going to do is briefly refer to 3 accidents. And what I'd like to stress about that is I'm only going to gloss over them because I want to use those accidents to make a point. But if any one of you is interested in any one of the accidents, they're very well documented on the web and make pretty interesting reading. The first one is Eastern Airlines, it's Lockheed 1011. Just before Christmas in 1972, that aircraft descended into Miami. They put the undercarriage down and they did not get a safe nose wheel light. And so the captain advised air traffic control. Air traffic control told him to go and maintain 2,000 feet and put them out in a holding area out over the Florida Everglades. Anyway, they flew around there and the captain assigned the first officer to fly the aircraft, which he did using the autopilot. And the captain knew that if you went down into the electronics bay underneath the cockpit, there was an indices where you could see 2 indices lined up that would tell you that the nose wheel was down and safe. So he sent the flight engineer down to do that. In the meantime, while the flight engineer was down there, the captain and first officer started disassembling the little nose wheel light to see that if it had been properly fitted. And the flight engineer came back. He said that they couldn't find the indices, so the captain sent him down for a better look. And while all this was going on, the aircraft commenced descending. Now, do you all understand what or know what's meant by control wheel steering? The term control wheel steering is a means of inputting an autopilot. If you've got the autopilot on and you put about 15 pounds of pressure on the actual controls, it inputs the autopilot and it will adopt the attitude that you put into it. In terms of pitch, it will just, if you pitch it forward, it'll put the aircraft into that attitude and it will stay there. So what happened was that while the 3 of them were involved in going up and down to the electronics compartment and looking at the globe, the aircraft had started descending. They got 3 warning chimes, which are heard on the cockpit voice recorder, and a very loud chime telling them that they were 250 feet off their assigned altitude. It didn't seem to ring a bell. That wasn't meant to be a play on words, sorry. Anyway, and very shortly after, they ploughed into the Everglades at just under 200 knots and descending at 3,000 feet a minute. And 97 people died. So you can, that says it all. There was no failure of the flight instruments. They did say that there was a slight possible excuse for the captain in that he was found to have had a tumour in his brain in the post-mortem. But they don't know whether that affected him or not. Okay, the second one we're going to look at, this was the holiday islands in the Canary Islands in the Atlantic Ocean, just off the coast of Africa, are very popular. Las Palmas is the main holiday resort. And there were jumbos taking passengers down there. But that day, the Las Palmas airport had a bomb scare. So they had to divert the two jumbos into Tenerife. Tenerife apparently has a very interesting weather phenomena that occurs there. It can go from virtually zero visibility to good visibility in minutes. And that seems to be due to low cloud, local winds and the local topography. Anyway, the jumbos were keen to get out, of course. And so two of them taxied, Pan American and KLM. KLM was up at the end of the runway, getting ready to take off. Pan Am was tracking down the runway and he was told to leave at a particular taxiway. But the visibility was so bad, he missed it. But he knew he missed it and he reported that he missed it. The KLM aircraft was very keen to get going. The captain was very, very anxious to get going. He knew that they were going to be on the limit of their duty time limitations, and he was worried about that, so he wanted to get going. And so he was all set to go, ready for takeoff, and he'd been cleared to line up, but not to take off. He intended to take off and virtually started opening the throttles. The flight engineer, first officer, both said to him, "We don't think Pan Am's off the runway." Pan Am reported 3 times that they were still on the runway, and somehow or other that call got missed. Also, there was a little bit of a language problem in that it's Spanish territory, and the controller's English may have been a little bit not quite right, but he did not clear the aircraft to take off. And so the captain, the Dutch captain, opened the throttles and took off. And of course, he collided with Pan American. And that became the worst accident in aviation history. It was just, I think, just over 500 people killed. He was a very senior pilot. He was the poster boy for the airline, actually. He had everything. Okay, next. Now, the last accident I'll look at is this one. This is a Douglas DC-8. It was descending into Portland, Oregon. And when he put the gear down, he had an unsafe indication on his right-hand main gear. So he went into a holding pattern while they started to try and sort the problem out. Interesting here that America has a system of flight dispatchers who keep an eye on each aircraft. I don't quite know how it works, but when the dispatcher knew that this United flight was holding, he told the captain what your fuel exhaustion time will be. He said, "Yeah, it will be at this minute, you will run out of fuel." So the captain was told that. Anyway, it seems that what happened is the captain became fixated on the fact that he wasn't going to get the gear problem fixed and he'd have to do an emergency landing. So he had the cabin crew preparing the passengers for an emergency landing. In the meantime, they just flew around using up fuel. And this is the accident which I believe was the straw that broke the camel's back when it came to the cockpit resource management course. I think this is what really made it happen. But the captain was being told that engines are failing through lack of fuel. Flight engineer, I think on the next slide, you'll see some of the discussion there. Flight engineer, we're going to lose number 3 in a minute. See that? Flight engineer, I'm showing 0. See there, all the warnings down. And eventually the first officer saying, there, get this, you can imagine what that is, get this on the ground. However, they flew around until they ran out of fuel. And it was almost exactly to the minute when the dispatcher told him it would. Fortunately, the accident The aircraft didn't get, it landed pretty flat, it was damaged but not wrecked. It probably didn't fly again. They had 10 people killed and about 29 seriously injured. Now, the United chief pilot, I imagine, was ropeable because the procedure was, well, the crew had been trained in the procedure of what to do for alternate gear extension. And they said, under that procedure, from the time of an event of finding that you've got a problem to being able to land was no more than 5 minutes. The crew had been trained in it and they practiced it in the simulator, yet they screwed it up. So I don't think I think that was the thing that finally pushed United into, we've got to do something about this. So United, being in America, America's full of corporations with management structures. So they turned to the academic world that has so many MBA courses and asked them to help set up a course for cockpit management. And the basis of the whole course was communication. And so United Airlines produced this course and then they brought it out to Australia in 1981 and they set up a sample course up in the Blue Mountains, invited representatives from the Australian Airlines, from the regulator, and from the Pilots Federation, which is how I got a gig. And we all went up to do this course. And the course was all about communication. They decided that for a captain to make the best use of the resources in the cockpit, to get what they call synergy, and synergy is defined as where any two brains or minds are better than one. And so they made it all about communication. And to communicate, as you all know, we all modify our communication on who we're talking to. And so, for instance, if your next door neighbour's bull mastiff comes in and mutilates your wife's little pussycat, and you're asked to go and talk to your neighbour, how you talk to him will depend on how you've got on with him, won't it? If you've had 30 years of good friendship with this bloke, have a beer with him occasionally, you'll treat him one way. If he's been a bloke that came over and abused you every time one of your autumn leaves flew over his fence, you'll approach him a different way. So what they wanted to teach us on this course was about communicating and about how to assess the person you're communicating with. So to do that, they produced this matrix. And this is a matrix where it's got a vertical scale of 1 to 9. And this scale was about how competent you were technically. So if we relate this to aviation, we'd say that the average Joe flying along in an airplane that he's pretty comfortable with might be a 5 or 6. The really ace bloke who, if he had a pair of pliers and spanners and some blocking wire, could build the airplane, he might be a 9. On this horizontal scale, we had people skills. 9 up here is the bloke who can communicate well. The bloke down here is the bloke who can't communicate at all. He's the bloke who was talking about the DC-3 before. We used to have a joke and say that every airline's got a 9-1 captain. And a 9-1 captain is a bloke who really knew his stuff, but he treated his crew like his sexual advisors. Now, when I want your effing advice, I'll ask for it. You could say that pretty much, that the DC-3 story, who was it told me that? Yeah, that bloke, that was a 9-1 captain. So they said, well, we'd like you to understand more about these characteristics. So they then spent a lot of time talking about how you could assess people using this scale. And having done that, they then said, now we're going to show you a movie. And they showed us this movie, 12 Angry Men. This is a movie about 12 men in a jury and how one guy swung the wrist and around to think his way. So what they did, they gave us each a sheet of paper on which they'd identified about 5 of the characters in the movie. And they said, and I'll just backtrack a bit there. I forgot to say at the start of the course, they divided us into parties of 6, and they said, you'll work in that same 6. for the whole course. And so they then said, we'll give you these sheets of paper. You'll all watch this movie. And then you'll go, and as you watch the movie, we'll ask you to assess these characters we've nominated. So this is part of the training process of learning how to assess people in communicating. They then said, after you've watched the movie, in your group of 6, you'll sit down with your group of 6 and talk about it. Each talk about how you assessed each person and see if you want to change it, or you can be convinced by the others that they thought differently. So it was training and reinforcing, and because you're getting your training from watching the movie and also training in talking about it. Having done that, and this has all taken place over a couple of days, they then said, we're now going to give you a crew exercise. Each one, we're going to give each one of the break up in a crew of 3, and we want you actually to sit in the seats like a captain, first officer, and flight engineer. And we'll give you a briefing for the captain, one for the first officer, one for the flight engineer. Now, I can't do that here, so this is the first part of what was on everybody's briefing. You're going to do a flight from you're on a flight from A to B with an alternate of C. Approaching a point 1 hour from B, which is also 1 hour's diversion time from C, you're advised that the runway intersection at A is blocked by a disabled aircraft and it will take 1 hour to clear it. The weather at B is fine. Weather at C is varying around the approach minimums with no improvement expected. An arrival at A would complete a 5-day away roster pattern, and diversion to B may require additional days to reposition the aircraft. And they stress that for this exercise, the outcome is not important, it's how you arrive at the decision. So then, having given you that briefing on the top of each bit of paper, we then go to the captain's briefing. And this says, his home is at B, he knows the airport staff well, he feels they're sure at taking a conservative approach to the time required to clear the damaged aeroplane. So that he'll be arguing from that point of view. The first officer is a single man. And on a recent scheduled overnight at sea, he met a very appealing lady. Yeah. And he knows an unscheduled overnight would enable him to meet her again. He knows the captain is very competent and an approach to ILS minimums or even a little below would not deter him from landing. So that's his bias. C, flight engineer. Flight engineer is a very new man to the company. He's a little bit in awe of the senior captain. He's not impressed by the first officer's cavalier attitude, and he's a bit nervous about the whole scene, the runway not being cleared or the approach weather below minimums. He doesn't want to upset the captain or be seen as a squib by the first officer. So now these 3 guys have each got that bias, and you're thinking, you're then asked to argue, what are we going to do? They weren't interested in the answer. It was how you went about the discussion. I might digress there and say the funny thing was that night, the senior TAA person there was our flight manager, flight training manager. He and I went back a long way and knew one another well. We spent till 1 o'clock in the morning drinking a lot of beer and arguing about what was the right answer. Anyway, the next part of the CRM course was they then said, we'll put the 6 of you now, you've had 3 days of training of conversational skills. So we're going to ask the 6 of you to sit down and one at a time, we'll go through one person at a time. And we want each one of the other 5 of you to describe him using a 1-word, non-adjectival statement. So if he was, you could say he was arrogant. You couldn't say he was very arrogant, say arrogant. And so the idea was at the end of the time, you had 5 people say how they saw each one person in that room. And then they then said, we'll then tie those words together and into a sentence, and gives you a bit of a picture of how other people see you. Now that was more or less the end of the American part of the course. I'll now move on to TAA. They liked the idea of the course, but they liked they didn't like this last bit, this encounter group thing. They thought that was a very American thing, something the Australians wouldn't naturally do. And I agree with them completely. So when they then set up what a similar course in TA called an Aircrew Team Management course, ATM. They also turned to academia, and they got some people from the university to help set it up, some psychologists and things. And there's a very interesting aspect there. The psychologists couldn't use this matrix anymore because this was intellectual property from America. So if we go to the next slide, they introduced this way of defining different people and talked a lot about how each one of those worked. And now the other thing that they did, which I found really interesting, was that they sent out to every person who was going to attend the course, they sent them out a little psychological questionnaire. Did you do that?
Yep.
Now, they said these will be absolutely de-identified. Nobody is ever going to see your one except you. And they said, what we'll do, we'll put these back through a computer, and it will help us help you see how we think you like to work. And they came up with this this diagram. Now, the word linked is wrong there. That should be linker. Because what they said was this was a rough matrix of how they thought people worked. So they said the captain's role is in the middle. He's the linker. He has to realise that you could have people from anywhere in these circles here in the cockpit. A management team can pick what they've got, but in the cockpit, you can't pick what you've got. You've got to work with what you've got. Now, I'll ask you a question. One of the things that happened with the TAA people, as I said, they were all de-identified. So they didn't know who was who, didn't want to. But what they did get was some statistics on where people fell. Where on that circle would you think the majority of airline pilots would fall? You're not far wrong. In the 4 o'clock to 6 o'clock position, over 90% of pilots fell in there. There were very few up in this, up in the top and 11 o'clock position. And what that meant to me, it occurred to me that I used to wonder why when airlines used psych testing to recruit pilots, what they were doing. Probably what they were doing was making sure that they mostly fell there, because that's where you want your good pilots. I remember my assistant siege and regional captain in Melbourne one time talking about another pilot who we'll call Joe Blow. And he said, Joe Blow's the perfect pilot. He said, I know he works here because I see his name on the roster occasionally. But he said, he just comes here, he goes to work, goes home, never bothers me, I don't bother him. Perfect pilot. Okay, moving on from there. The TAA course then went on doing much the same as the American course. They used a film to try and teach people to analyse other people's styles. Now, over time, the CRM courses have gone on. Most people do them every year or every 2 years. They do a refresher. And so over time, there's been a few changes and things to CRM. So we'll talk about those a little bit. Some of the things that changed over the time with CRM was that you didn't have to have special training to be a CRM presenter. And a lot of people decided they wanted to do it. And especially older pilots who are coming towards their retirement, they saw this as a way of doing it in their retirement. And if they were doing the course annually, they couldn't go presenting the same thing every time. So the course, they would change a little bit. And so I remember, because I worked for 2 different airlines, and I was later a regulator and I audited other people doing CRMs. I've seen a lot of CRMs and I've seen how they have changed. And what they would do, they'd say, righto, well now, as a crew exercise, we might do something. One I saw was we'll spend the whole time discussing on what are the 10 best survival items to take on a flight over a remote country. And so what happened was that over a period of time, there was a bit, I guess you'd say, a bit of a Chinese whisper. The courses just gradually changed. And they weren't the same as the original course with its heavy emphasis on just communication. The other thing that was a bit of a problem was that sometimes they talk about cockpit gradient. And the cockpit gradient is the difference between a senior captain and junior first officer. And that gradient can make a lot of difference to how people communicate. And that can also have, that gradient can be also have a lot to do with different countries. The Asian countries were seen to have a very steep cockpit gradient because the Asians are very good about teaching their children to respect their elders. So it was hard for a young person to be taught to speak up to an elder. It wasn't seen as such much of a problem in Australia. In fact, quite the contrary, because as a junior first officer, when I first started in TAA, I was mostly flying with captains who were a lot older than me, and many of them were ex-World War II pilots. And there was a really good, what you might, for want of better words, say, a sort of a master and apprentice relationship. And the company expected every captain to critique the first officer. And we expected to be critiqued, we didn't mind. And so the cockpit gradient was never much of a problem, but it was a problem as I said, in some of these other countries. And so one of the things that the CRM has to do in those cultures is try and make people understand the difference between assertiveness and aggressiveness. And that's quite a big step. The other thing we had to be a bit careful about in CRM is that it had to be very careful not to take away the authority of the captain. The captain it was about teaching him to use the crew as a resource, asking the crew to be prepared to be a resource. But it wasn't cockpit by committee. The buck still stopped with the captain. And that had to be emphasised more, I think. We'll move on now. Now there was another thing to come. There was another C in cockpit resource management, and the C was crew, because the aeroplanes have got crew. Now, I'll give you a couple of examples of where crew could have helped. This was a British Midland 737, took off, climbing across the middle of England, and they got cockpit smoke and some rough running. And the captain decided that the right-hand engine was the problem. The first officer eventually reluctantly agreed, and the captain shut it down and asked for a diversion into Midlands Airport. The captain then did something which I think is unusual. He made a PA to the passengers and said, "I have shut down the right-hand engine and we are diverting." Now, if you're in a propeller aircraft and you feather a propeller, and the passenger looks out the window and sees a prop stop, that's probably a fair call to say, "I've stopped the engine." But I don't see any reason to tell them why a jet engine stopped. They can't see it. Don't worry. Anyway, having said that it's a right engine, the passenger then said to one of the flight attendants, "It's funny," he said, "you shut down the right engine because there's all sorts of sparks coming out of the left-hand one." Anyway, but that didn't get transmitted to the captain, and he approached, and on approach, the left-hand engine failed just short. And there's the wreckage there on the right. He just about made it to the runway. Quite a few people died in that. So that was an example of where better use could have been made of the crew. If the flight attendant had rushed up to the cockpit and if the passenger had told the flight attendant and she'd rushed up and told the captain, he might have acted differently. I've actually had a personal experience of using the crew in a funny sort of way. The Fokker Friendship has a cabin compressor on the back of the engine, and we call it a blower, and that blower is made of magnesium. So if it starts to disintegrate inside and goes on fire, it's a very fierce, hot fire, and it's right near the wing spar. So you've got to take it seriously. So in the Flock of Friendship, they had a light called a spill valve light. And if the blower was burning or breaking up, the spill valve light would come on, and you had to feather the engine straight away. Well, I was on a long night flight one night, and the spill valve light came on. But there must have been a history in TAA at least of these lights coming on as false warnings, because we had a procedure in the book that said, if you get this light, before you shut the engine down, send someone down and have a look. Sit at the window beside the engine and see if there's any sparks coming out of the spill valve outlet. If there's not, you can consider it a false warning. So this night, off went the first officer, and while he was down there, the light went out anyhow, and he came back and he said, no sparks. Okay, forget about it. He'd hardly put his seatbelt on before the light came on again. So off you go again. And that happened 3 times. So it became obvious that this is going to go on all night. And we couldn't keep going down there, but we couldn't ignore it, because one time it might be fair dinkum. So we then got a flight attendant, got her up, briefed her, and sat her down at the window and said, now, if you see any sort of a spark come out of there, come up and tell us. So that was a place where we could use the crew as a resource. Does everybody know what a tailpipe fire is? Or better question, does anyone not know what a tailpipe fire is on startup? Well, on starting up a jet engine, if the fuel-air mixture doesn't ignite quite properly and you get unburnt fuel being taken out the back with the air, as it goes over the turbine, it can get hot again and can reignite. And you can get a pretty nasty fire in the tailpipe. Unless it causes an extreme over temperature, which you would see in the cockpit, you probably wouldn't even know what was happening. And what will happen as the engine spills up to speed, it blows itself out. The person who's most likely to see it will be the ground engineer who's walking out with you during a pushback. And this happened in a wide-bodied aircraft where they were pushing back, all the doors closed, of course, so they would be, and a passenger saw tailpipe fire. And he screamed out, "We're on fire, get us out of here." And the flight attendant said, "Okay, evacuate." Next thing you know, the engineer said, "Hey, Captain, all your doors are open, the slides are out, and people are jumping out of the airplane." And so the lesson there was that the crew needed to be told. Now, you can't train the crew for every flight attendant for every possible thing that could happen in an airplane. But what they could do is, when they had an experience like that, they address it in the next annual emergency procedures renewal training that the cabin crew do. So I'll show you this next slide, but I want you to see what a tailpipe looks like. Now have a look at the bloke in the window watching this. And you watch how quickly it goes out there. There is. Now the engine's running normally, blowing it out. But you can imagine how a passenger would react to that. Yeah. Now, we've been talking about cockpit resource management. One of the best bits of cockpit resource management where it was used properly was this DC-10 flight. The DC-10 was a United Airlines airplane, and this landed at a place called Sioux City in Iowa. Once again, it's on the web. But what happened was that the turbine let go, and like a big circular saw it way through the back of the airplane, burnt cut all the hydraulic pipes, and of course the controls are all hydraulically operated, no reversion. So suddenly they had an aeroplane with no control. All hydraulic lines had been cut. They had no hydraulics. And the captain found by juggling the throttles, he could get a little bit of control. And there was a passengering supervisory captain from the airline on board. Captain got him up to the cockpit to help. So that's very good cockpit resource management. And he managed the throttles to try and keep the airplane under control. And amazingly, they've got this airplane without control down to very close to a successful landing. They diverted into Sioux City, and they were looking pretty good on final approach, and they lost it at the last minute. And the airplane cartwheeled down the runway. And I think there were over 180 survivors on the aircraft. So it was a brilliant bit of cockpit resource management. Anyway, I think that pretty sums up. No, one more thing I'm going to say. I had a surprising thought. I had the opportunity of attending an Air Force pilot briefing for a fly past of jet aircraft not long ago. And it was all single pilot aircraft. And it was a good briefing, as the Air Force ones always are. And but I was surprised at the end of the briefing. He said, "Now don't forget your CRM." And I thought, I'll be bugging. CRM, single pilot. Hadn't thought about that. So I said to him can you elaborate a little bit on, do you have CRM procedures for single pilot? He said, "Oh, yes." So I said, "Well, what do you want?" And he said, "Well, if you've got another aircraft in trouble, you can do the checklist for him. You can call the checklist. You can do his radio. You can take his whole workload off him." And I thought, of course, I always knew that, didn't I? But I didn't. And it was quite an eye-opening thing. Now, I'm going to digress completely now because I just want to show you these movies. There are 4 movies here, the DVDs. I'm going to leave them here, so if anybody wants to borrow them, you're welcome. But the one that they used, the CRM course I did, was 12 Angry Men. But this is another one, 13 Days. This was about the Cuban Missile Crisis and how Kennedy handled that. And that's another excellent film on CRM. This one I've seen used. It's not that convincing. It's 12 O'Clock High, and it's about a unit commander in the American Air Force, and he was a competent commander, but he was a bit too soft on his men. So they sent in a tough guy to toughen up the discipline. So it's okay. This one I've never seen, and it's brilliant. If I was ever asked to give a captain a briefing on what makes a good captain, I'd use that film. It's called Master and Commander, played by Russell Crowe as the actor. It's set in the early 18th century on a British Royal Navy ship during the Napoleonic Wars. And there's not, as you go through the movie, you can just see point after point after point of really good command. It's a brilliant film if you get the chance to watch it. Now, so just to finish, this is another thing I saw which is not related to CRM, but I was on a holiday in Japan a couple of years ago, and we went on a country train, and the train was one where you could sit up the front, looking out the front window of the train, beside the driver who sat in a little cubicle on the left-hand side. Now, I was sitting there videoing out the front of the train, and then I saw what you'll see in a moment. I've asked my son to cut this right back because there was too much stuff at the beginning of it, so we go straight to the action, so it'll happen quickly. Okay, so I thought, what the hell's he doing? But as the train went on, I watched him do that a whole lot of time. And it's a Japanese safety system. It's got a name called, somewhere here, I got it down. Oh, I can't find it now, sorry. But it's a system they use throughout the Japanese rail. And what they do is every time they're coming to a signal where it can be go or no go, if it's go, they say go, they point and they say it, go. And when he was pointing over there, he was looking at his schedule, and I stood behind him later on, watched him do it a few more times, and he also went down there where he had an annunciator panel. So he was looking, I'm clear to go, I'm on time, and the thing's all working. Now, the fast trains in Japan are amazing. The Shinkansen, they call them. They're 200k trains, and there's tons of them. They run every few minutes. They run on the same lines where there'll be trains going non-stop and other trains stopping. So how you sequence it all, I don't know. But they've done it for 50 years without an accident. And so this safety system of theirs is really worth looking at. And after I saw that, I thought, I must tell CASA about that. Not that I quite know how you do it in an aeroplane, but it makes you wonder whether or not there could be some adaptation of it. And before I had a chance to talk to CASA, someone else had said it in, because CASA had an article about it in their magazine. And they too couldn't find a way to use it. But I thought about it, and I was thinking one way I would think I could use it, but not in an aeroplane, was in a car. If you're teaching someone to drive, one of the decision points in teaching a person to drive is approaching a traffic light. Because as the police say, the amber light is not the end of the green, it's the beginning of the red. So we all know when you're driving towards that light, you've got a point, a go, no-go point where you say, well, do I slam the brakes on and stop, or can I keep on going? And I thought that's almost a point where you could say, I'll have my hand up, and when I get to that point, say, go. Anyway, that's by the way. So thanks, gentlemen. If anyone's got any questions, I'll try and answer them.
The only time I've ever had anything to do with pointing, and it's going to be difficult, pointing, I found in air traffic control that when something was really going wrong and I was really talking to somebody, I used to point at him as I talked to him. And everybody said, one day you're going to go like that and follow your finger to the floor, you fool.
No, good on you, Bob.
Thanks very much, Ray, for that very enlightening briefing. I would have to say, there wasn't enough attention given to cockpit management back when I was doing my own commercial flight training. And in fact, my own very poor cockpit management made itself felt very badly when I was undertaking a freight flight back from Longreach to Emerald in the late 1980s, and which eventually led to my having to make an unscheduled landing on a very wet, muddy, unsealed road just outside of Springshaw, only a few minutes before the last light. That story, the detail of that story can wait for another time. That's not my purpose tonight. With your commenting about that episode in the Canary Islands in 1977, as far as I know, that's still the world's worst aviation disaster. Associated with that was probably the world's worst marketing industry disaster. What had happened was that KLM had been running quite a broad worldwide marketing campaign in the few months before that accident, where they'd made Jacob Van Zandt, the captain, the focus of that campaign, where they were inviting, the public worldwide to come flying with them, with the KLM's most experienced, safest pilot. The fact that that ad was still running about a week or two after the accident, before someone realised and pulled the ad.
What I should say, the cockpit resource management was put in the category of what they call non-technical skills. The other one is human factors, and now every pilot be a commercial pilot. By the time he gets to be a commercial pilot, he's done courses and training in both CRM and human factors.
The only thing I can think of to add to what was said there about KLM was that the company then had to find somebody to be the investigator for the company on the accident. And the first guy they rang or tried to ring was that guy, was the pilot. The company had to have an investigator for their own investigation into it, and the first person that they rang or tried to ring was that captain who just crashed.
There's more to all those stories. All of those accidents I mentioned are all very interesting to read, and the documentation, including the accident reports on the web, are very good. They're very, very good to read. Strangely enough, there was a reluctance to blame the pilot, and not even much, not much mention of CRM or anything like that. I think what happened, you see, years before that, every accident was the pilot's fault. Everything was pilot error. And it got to the stage where the term pilot error became a dirty word. And then, so nobody was using it. And I think now, come this period, they're saying, well, these are errors, but we can't just glibly say pilot error. Let's investigate a little bit more, because the human being is a machine too. Let's see how that machine works.
The Air Canada aircraft at Sydney Airport, where the Air Canada aircraft had landed, the controller had said, first taxiway right. And after the TAA aircraft had clipped the Air Canada aircraft, and in the subsequent investigation, when the cockpit voice recorder was accidentally erased, the Canadian crew,
Actually, it wasn't erased. They just weren't. The union wouldn't let them use it.
oh, right, okay, right. So that's what happened. But the Canadian crew stuck to their story that what they heard was backtrack if you like. There's a certain rhyme in those words.
The pilot who was flying the 727, CA 727, 727, yeah. He, when he saw the accident about that he knew he was likely to hit it, he had some options of what he could do, and he was praised very much because he was a former test pilot in the company, and he thought, I'll get the best rotation, best climb of the aircraft by very carefully flying it exactly as the book says. So he didn't try to pull it up, or he just flew it as accurately as he could. And they said, as a result, he got the best clearance he could have got.
I think the metals did scrape though.
They hit her
Cut
right.
the bottom off.
Oh, yeah, it scoured the belly out of the 727.
An extra minor thing that helped that happen in the first place was the fact that it was the time when they were extending runway 16. At that stage, there was a lot of work going on at the end there, and there were lights and things like that. And so the pilots taking off in the 727 looked up, and I didn't really realise that the lights I was seeing on the DC-8 doing the U-turn instead of turning off to the right. It's just an extra minor additional thing which added the fact that there were runway work going there, so they weren't surprised to see lights flashing.
It was a dark, rainy night as well, wasn't it?
Not particularly rainy, you think necessarily, but that wasn't to do with anyway. They went, and as you say, they were stuck. They realised they would have been worse if they tried to stop and crashed into it. That's been very good that you're talking about on the whole talk this evening, but in TAA, as I was, I had just done my A300 course when that was coming in, and we did a 5-day course down in Victoria. Every pub in turn, all pilots went to this sort of thing, got the whole thing. There were lots of examples given of examples where cockpit resource was bad in the way that Bill wouldn't be able to talk up. One example had that some aircraft had the FO saying, trying to take to the captain, we need to do something. And the FO saying, you're going to crash, you're going to crash. And he just ignored him and crashed. Things like that. But
Yeah.
No. There was one of the stories we were told about that this is what you've got to learn to not have
Yeah.
And it was emphasised the way this business of, especially with, as we said, Europe, Asian airlines, they tend to have this business where the captains of ops and the FA just sit there and don't do anything until they're told to, or you got to see the boss. And
I have to say, even though I made that comment about the Asian airlines, that was something that was emphasised in the beginning of CRM when they talked about cockpit grading. I did 10 years in an Asian airline and I never found that a problem.
they sorted it out then.
Yeah, no, I found them, the cockpit discipline was really good. There was a certain formality. I remember when I first joined the airline, the first officer would meet you and it'd be yes, captain, no, captain. And you'd say, my name's Ray, but he'd say, yes, captain. But by the time I left 10 years later, they were much more relaxed.
Nothing from the floor, nothing more? Anybody out in Zoom land got some questions they'd like to ask? It appears not. Looks like it's all over for you, Ray. You can sit down. Well, thank you, gentlemen.
Yeah.